Max Factor was not just a brand. He was a person, and he invented so many innovations in cosmetics, from day-to-day foundation to waterproof mascara. His legacy is unrivaled by anyone. So why then, with all this incredible legacy, does the brand struggle today? This video is informed by these books. All affiliate links are below, but as always, please do check with your local library for the books first. The first thing that you should know about the history of Max Factor is historical context. As in, when the company first was founded, makeup was still quite the taboo. Of course, women were wearing makeup, that had happened for centuries, but at this time in history, it was much more culturally appropriate to wear makeup in the pursuit of looking totally natural and not made up. This, of course, is in reference to the 1800s, and of course isn't all women, just that was the dominant view of makeup at the time, including in Poland, where the journey of Maximilian Factorwitz's business began in 1885. He wasn't legally established as a sole trader yet, he was 8, but he was making his own cosmetics on the side while apprenticing for a pharmacist/apothecary, where he was discovering his talent for cosmetic chemistry. In fact, he was so well received at this age that only by the following year he was able to achieve another apprenticeship at Lodz's, which were a leading wig maker and cosmetician in Poland specifically for performers. From here, he would move to Anton of Berlin in 1891, where at only age 14 he was able to work with the Corpo, which was traveling from city to city doing the makeup for clients like the Imperial Russian Grand Opera. This is really how his personal career had begun, as his talents at mixing makeup were developed on some of the most impressive stages in Europe. But in terms of the business, this is also relevant because he was mixing his own products through all of this time, using them on his clients. However, he very much was not established as a company until he was 22, after his mandatory military service was completed after a period of 4 years. Max Factor was begun as a small cosmetic store just outside of Moscow in Ryazan in 1899. So it was here that he sold his own creams, rouges, fragrances, and wigs, all developed in his youth. Obviously, the shop was small, really wasn't especially well aimed towards anyone in particular. He just liked to create and was totally satisfied with the life that he was making for himself in this way, away from the unfortunately unpleasant experiences that he had had in his teen years. Which, by the way, if you would like a biography on Max Factor for more details, do let me know. I love them, I just know that they're not everybody's cup of tea, so let me gauge interest in the comments. So, this is how Max Factor really began, as a small shop in Russia with no dreams of making it any bigger. But, though he loved his quiet business, he was simply too talented for that to be the end. You see, a traveling theatre group that he had sold to recently, unbeknownst to him, had performed for the imperial family. And within weeks, his cosmetics were all the rage in the summer court, leading him to receive the offer of a cosmetician job for the Imperial Russian Grand Opera, Alexander Nikolaevich, who was the uncle to Tsar Nicholas II, and the Tsar's personal physician. But he hated the job. He wanted just to stay back with his small shop and live a simple life. But of course, when I said offer, that was being very generous, because in his own words, quote, his services had not been requested, they had been commanded. He was able to keep his small shop during this time, so it wasn't the end of his business, but he was always the on-demand cosmetician whenever and wherever they needed him. To quote Maximilian directly, quote, I was the same as a slave. The only thing I wanted was to be free. This is a bit of an extreme phrase, but he also went on to say, quote, every time I go out, a dozen people watch what I'm doing. They follow me, I have no life, I am only a creature to make beautiful the court, not to live myself. Under the Tsar's rules, he was only permitted to visit his shop once a week, and only then for a couple of hours, so that he could just collect supplies and attend to business. But of course, this was always accompanied by guards, as was any movement that he made outside of the court, so it never really felt like he was free to attend his shop, more that he was doing an outing on business. This literally carried on for years, in which time he secretly, and against the Tsar's rules, married a woman named Esther Rosa, with whom he had 3 secret children, named Frida, Cecilia, and Davis. Though because of the Tsar's rules, they also barely met for fear of repercussions. But it was not only his marriage that was forbidden. You see, the factors were actually Jewish. In Russia, in the very early 1900s, when Nicholas II ordered a siege on the Jews, burning down their villages due to his fear of an uprising. Obviously, Maximilian knew that he was safe, he was adored by the court, but the same was not true of his secret wife and children. So, with the help of an incredibly kind general, they staged an escape through the woods near Carlsbad to a boat called the Molka III, where passports didn't exist then, on February the 13th, 1904, the family of 5 boarded their journey to America. Obviously, this did mean the end of the Max Factor first shop, but Maximilian already had the plan to continue his cosmetics business in America. He of course knew the World's Fair, it was world famous already, but it was to be held in Louisiana in America that year, and so he was planning on trying to get a stall there to display his cosmetics. The only problem was, without English, he just didn't really know how. From his work with the Imperial Court, though, he had saved a store of $40,000, which in 2024 is just over 1.4 million USD. So his problem really wasn't for the lack of money, he just lacked English. But in this, he was also exceptionally fortunate, because on that cruise journey, when he was staying with the upper classes, he met another young man who could speak not only his native Polish, but English, German, and Russian, and was more than willing to help him translate. Actually, they got on so swimmingly that by the time the boat arrived in New York, he had already offered him capital to finance his exhibition. Also, and this is just a tidbit, it was on the disembarkation that Maximilian, not being able to speak English, was unable to tell the customs officer that he had spelt his name, Factor, wrong on all of his family's immigration cards, and so he acquiesced to his family's new name of Factor, spelt with a C, a name that would soon become world famous. The fair itself was the biggest world fair thus far, and demand for a stall was exceptionally high. So, by the time that the man, new associate, and family eventually made it to Louisiana, there was nothing left for Factor in the central area as he wanted. He'd really only left a couple of weeks before the exhibition anyway, so there was very little chance there was going to be space. Instead, he ended up at the Palace of Varied Industries and Manufacture in a tiny space far from the main walkways of the exhibition circuit, where he was ready to sell his cosmetics, perfumes, combs, hair products, and hairpieces, known as switches and curls, to whomever may pass his stall. In the end, the fair, which lasted a week, was a mild success. They made more profit than they had expected, which was great considering that the space cost him most of the money that he had brought with him, but on the final day, his partner didn't show up, and instead left him with bare shelves and an empty money caddy. He'd been robbed by his own partner. This brings us back to the opening point of this video. Maximilian was talented, undoubtedly, but who would he now sell his cosmetics to? Generally, everyday people didn't really wear cosmetics, and if they did, it certainly was not the stage makeup that he was producing, so he couldn't exactly sell to things like a local drugstore. So he, without any English, just didn't know where to go. He didn't know what he could possibly do. Maximilian's ever-evolving business therefore became Factor's Barber Shop, a men's salon with bathing, haircutting, grooming, and shaving offered at 1513 Biddle Street in St. Louis, Missouri. Largely this time in his life is inconsequential to the actual business, but you should know that it was profitable through many personal trials, and it was here that he learned of something called photoplays, specifically one photoplay that you may know called The Great Train Robbery. This was the world's first movie, even though it was only about 9 minutes long. He became intensely interested, and hearing of the burgeoning industries in New York, New Jersey, and Chicago that were all now moving to the West Coast, he figured now was his time to try his hand at servicing these performers. as he had served the Russians, Germans, and Polish performers for so long. This move would take place on the 11th of October 1908, after which he opened a small shop named Max Factor's Antiseptic Hair Store on 1204 South Central Avenue in the newly bustling downtown LA.
This is usually where you'll find the history of Max Factor begins in most chronologies, as this is the first time the company was established on American soil on the 11th of October 1909 as Max Factor and Company.
Of course, it took all of the same products that he had developed from his previous business with it, so in my opinion, I think the actual product development counts as the beginning of the business, but you can decipher that for yourself. In any regard, this naturally included all the products that he was known to provide before. He had wigs, hairpieces, toupees, and also his own line of theatrical makeup, including face powders, rouge, cleansing cream, and lip rouge, as well as he would stock established competitor brands like Leichner and Minor, who he was an official distributor of. These all were thick, stage makeup brands that were impossible to wear naturally during the day. The makeup was so thick, at about 1/8 of an inch, it created almost like a mask on the skin. Because of this, when Maximilian saw some actors rehearsing for a movie in 1910 who weren't obviously wearing anything like the cosmetics that he knew or that he stocked, he was interested. After inquiring directly to the actors, he found out that they wore, quote, concoctions they had made themselves, odd mixtures of Vaseline and flour, lard and cornstarch, or cold cream and paprika. The more adventurous had even tried ground brick dust mixed with Vaseline or lard to get a flesh-colored look. It took him a while to realize, but it soon became apparent stage makeup was simply far too heavy-duty to work on film. You see, stage makeup at this time, being as thick as it was,
made the actors look particularly old and was therefore entirely unflattering and would even crack due to its unforgiving consistency.
Hairline cracks, of course, nothing problematic for the stage, but on screen, they were glaringly obvious. They would ruin the movie, causing the stage makeup to pretty much be obsolete. Maximilian had found his calling. He went immediately to his lab in the back of his shop and began formulating a foundation that would be able to provide full coverage while appearing natural and, importantly, would not crack. This literally took him years of experimentation, and by 1913, so 4 years later, it was still not finished when he met Cecil B. DeMille, a movie director and producer. Actually, met may be a bit of a stretch here. Forced himself into a meeting with, only to be rejected, is much more accurate. But obviously his cosmetics were not yet perfected, so he was turned down. Instead, his pitch turned onto theatrical wigs. Having seen how bad the wigs actually were, for men specifically on these sets, he wanted to offer DeMille his grade A human hair lace wigs and pieces for use on screen, something that he had long been known for since his teen years. But again, he was rebuffed. To be fair, it wasn't like DeMille didn't like the pieces, he really did, but they were just too expensive. So instead, he proposed something quite novel: a rental agreement. Obviously, Maximilian had never heard of wigs being rented for theatre before. Usually they're kept for the whole run of the show. But Maximilian eventually agreed, with the caveat that his sons could be extras in the movie to keep an eye on the very expensive wigs. The first movie produced with the wigs was called The Squaw Man, and it was a massive success. Soon filmmakers across Los Angeles needed his realistic wigs for themselves, all with the same rental agreement that they must include his 3 sons. In fact, I've skipped over a few births here, but it wasn't long before now his 5 children were all enlisted to work in the business. The boys as actors, overseeing the wig safety, and his 2 daughters as cosmeticians. The word makeup still hadn't yet been popularized, and they also worked as hairdressers/wig makers, though all children did know every skill: how to make cosmetics, how to cut hair for men and women, including wigs, and how to protect the safety of expensive wigs from being flung across sets by unkind actors. Quickly, the company expanded. They hired the children's school friends as assistants where needed, and the shop was doing really well as well. But in all of this time, more importantly than the wigs, was his own line of cosmetics development, which he had continued endlessly until 1914, when Max Factor created the world's first cream grease paint, improving on the formula of the previous, which was a grease paint stick, and providing it in 12 shades. Adopted first by the arguably more popular comedic actors like Charlie Chaplin, it wasn't long before his grease paint was the industry standard across the now booming Hollywood industry, even to the point that the shop started opening at 5:30 a.m. so that customers could buy their own makeup, which was standard for the time, before heading to the set. By 1914, 2 years after he became an American citizen, he had had several hit products, like his notable henna shampoo, and even he was sitting on products that he knew would be hits to come. For example, an eyebrow pencil for a yet-to-be-announced non-theatrical line, and the world's first commercial eyeshadow in his henna eyeshadow. So, in order to set himself up for success, he moved his store to the second floor of the Pancake building, where he could more easily access a whole new set of clients in the public. Though, of course, the stigma of makeup still existed, so they still sold mainly to performers. It's just that they were open to the public here. Here, in this shop, he made one very important innovation. Potentially, the world's first makeover station. Literally, it was a room dedicated to styling a client's hair and makeup privately. Something that seems so simple now, but was a great innovation for the day and allowed his now famous clients a relaxing space for them to have their hair, beards, and cosmetics done before work. The salon was a ridiculous success, with both male and female movie stars, comedians, matinee performers, literally an endless list of names from all kinds of performing arts, lining up every day to have their beauty done before heading to set. This continued for the next 3 years as the booming small business Maximilian had always wanted for himself. All up until February 1917, when the very first Hollywood script included the need for a makeup artist written in the script and in the budget. That makeup artist, naturally, was Maximilian Factor, turning him from only an industry-known name to someone whose fame was only set to increase. More innovations followed. A supreme liquid whitener which evened pale complexions to the same shade, a color harmony line of face powders, the first to expand from the industry standard of 3 shades to a whopping 11, and he even expanded into false eyelashes. His business boomed to such an extent that they soon outgrew the sizable space in the Pancake building. So they moved to a warehouse on the nearby Brooklyn Avenue, though that too was not enough, and they moved once again to 326 South Hill Street, where they engaged a space titled Max Factor's Supreme, the House of Makeup, a word that he, due to his growing English skills,
had adopted a few years before, spelling it with a hyphen and becoming known as such for his making up of clients. The word did exist before. In fact, theatre and vaudeville performers had been using it for decades at this point, but the word, much like the idea of makeup entirely, was still very much a taboo in polite society with connotations of prostitutes.
So it still really wasn't a word that caught on outside of the performers attending his shop, making it in a way an in-word for Max's tribe of clients. For this reason, Max had unwittingly created an underground popularity of his products used in the daytime, a group of in-the-know people who were able to make that initial underground buzz, that core of people that are so often integral to a trend or phrase taking hold.
In fact, by 1920, when launching his public-aimed line Society Makeup, Maximilian Factor
was still apprehensive of using the term makeup, still spelled with a hyphen, in his products for that reason, despite his growing cult of followers. However, when his son Frank told him it was time to start a new tradition, the packaging was thus changed to be sold as Make Up for the first time.
Though he did purposefully counterbalance the sexuality of the word makeup with the word society in the title of the line to make it seem a little less risque. And it worked. Society Makeup, which consisted of makeup and skincare, by the way, not just makeup, was sold all across the US and even in London, making it, quote, the first international makeup available worldwide. It was a smash success. The term makeup quickly caught on after some initial pushback, and the rest was history.
With that said, however, by 1922, Max Factor's own cosmetics still really weren't selling much outside of his own store. He never actively promoted them despite his rising fame, while he was carrying the other brands Leichner and Minor, who did do their own promotion. Simply, he was just satisfied with his small-ish business. That is literally all he had ever wanted for himself. At least that was until his trip to Germany to ask Leichner for a bigger commission on his sales. He was their top distributor in America after all. He should get a bigger cut of the profits. But they snubbed him. They wouldn't meet him, they didn't tell him why, and simply left him to wait for an hour outside their office. He was furious. He had sat on an idea for their grease paint for so long, and now he was being snubbed? Immediately, he cabled his children, who were looking after the shop, to take the innovation that he was going to share for his own products. To start selling the Max Factor Grease Paint Foundation, not in jars as it was before, but in tubes. A more hygienic and frankly clean way to access the makeup that also allowed for a more even and light application of the product. The paint now came in 31 shades, from white, I'm assuming this is what we would know as clown white today, through to very light pink, sallow, saltburn, dark brown, and black, each in Kelly green tubes. Immediately, he outsold Leichner and Minor combined to now have the #1 brand on the market. That slight snub from Leichner made Max Factor & Company a real force to be reckoned with. By the time he had returned in 1924, his sons, specifically Frank, now just shy of 20, and Davis, 22, had turned the business into its most profitable iteration. And as a result, they took on much larger roles in the company. Davis as a general manager, and Frank in training to be a perfumer while currently working as a field tester for the Color Harmony line. This, in turn, allowed Maximilian time to spend directly with his clients on special projects for their movies, including for the film Mare Nostrum creating the world's first waterproof mascara. He also created teeth paint for both whitening and blacking out teeth, and he also continued to invent new hairstyles that created the careers for people like Greta Garbo and Norma Shearer. From here, it was really his sons who were the ones to begin overseeing the business expansion side as well. Firstly, with their father's permission, they bought a nearby building to lease out, but when that finished, they expanded into a manufacturing plant, complete with large powder mills and electric grinding machines. And secondly, they began promoting more heavily into the public space. This started small at first, local competitions and demonstrations by Max Factor himself, all to promote his non-theatrical line of makeup that was far more subtle and notably without his famous grease paint. Following this, the company then hired trained makeup artists to take over these demonstrations, which soon caught the attention of Sales Builders Incorporated. Sales Builders Inc. ran advertising, distribution, and sales for several companies across the US and were interested in representing Max Factor's non-theatrical line of cosmetics across America. Of course, they signed a contract with them, and within days, they began the market research for a new way to enter the market to really launch Max Factor across the states. All of their lengthy research eventually would come to a scheme in October 1927 in the form of the Color Harmony Prescription Makeup Chart that would teach customers which face powder, rouge, and either lip pomade or lipstick was most complementary to their skin, hair, and eye tone. Now, this idea wasn't inherently new. Max Factor didn't invent the idea of having your perfect shade for the tones in your face. That was already established. However, he did popularize the idea across the US, and of course, it helped that these were by far the most popular products on the market in general, but it was an enormous success, often selling 3 products instead of 1 to customers, growing the company to significant new heights. They were also continuing to use Factor's movie celebrities to sell the products to new stockists with things like testimonials from the day's hottest stars that they could display in their own store. By October 1929, Max Factor's panchromatic makeup was trademarked, and he had secured his name in the history books of makeup for the every woman. As a result, the company outgrew the space that he was in, and his locations thusly expanded across Hollywood to meet the new demand, into a sprawling ex-bowling alley at 166 North Highland Avenue, Hollywood, California. This was purchased actually in early 1928, so before the Max Factor's panchromatic makeup was trademarked, but the building was only renovated and occupied by the 17th of November 1929 after a massive updating that took the building to be an incredible sight to see. Quote, "The palatial salon was in the style of Louis XIV. Designed in muted jewel tones with gold and bronze accents, it was grand in every way. The walls of the octagonal room were lined with mirrors and topped with curved friezes dedicated to the vanities of the day: music, opera, dance, and motion pictures. Gorgeous imported crystal chandeliers hung from coffered ceilings. Trompe-l'oeil details separated recessed illuminated wall displays, while prismatic glass showcases held everything from perfumes and cosmetics to powder puffs, hairpieces, and false eyelashes. Underfoot was a beautiful parquet flooring. One showcase featured custom makeup cases, the most expensive, covered in patent leather and filled with exquisite combs and brushes. Cut glass perfume spray bottles, plate glass mirrors, and glittering accessories were favored by Hollywood newcomers who seemed to believe that these would help them break into show business. There was also a makeup and consultation room, a wig department complete with fitting room, a new product development laboratory, a perfumery, a large manufacturing room, several offices, a club room, which was like a private chill-out room, not like a nightclub, and on the top floor was another wig department complete with packaging assembly line. The place was palatial and quickly became a beacon of the company's success, where they would soon, and sorry to turn this into a footnote, develop the entire process of airbrushing makeup. Another thing that is unfortunately going to be a footnote in this is the Great Depression, which began on Black Friday, October 29th, 1929. And that's simply because it just didn't affect the business nor the movies very much. Really, the only change that happened was that their demonstrations and free makeovers, which were once held on the beach, were now going to be held in theatre lobbies, movie theatre lobbies specifically, where they could meet people obviously interested in movies, and also people that had a few pennies to spare. Of course, they were right, and business just continued to boom. By this point, he was truly famous as a makeup artist for all of his celebrity clients and cosmetic innovations. However, his English was so bad still by this point that the company had to take measures in the early 1930s to remove him from the spotlight. Not because he wasn't good representation, of course not, but because he was so often misquoted or misunderstood in interviews that it was simply too risky. This is why, in my opinion, so few people know that Max Factor was an actual person. I mean, that as well as the fact that Max Factor could easily just be a phrase like top element. But either way, instead they expanded into an in-house PR department who would come to be truly really important for the company. This was because the time this decision was made tied in with a new surge of anti-makeup sentiment that this book describes as, quote, "The immoral word makeup had replaced the more refined and acceptable cosmetics, triggering widespread unrest and controversy. Husbands, scandalized by their wives' tarty new looks, filed for divorce. Horrified parents locked rebellious daughters in their rooms. A bill introduced in the Kansas legislature threatened to make it a misdemeanor for any woman under the age of 44 to wear cosmetics for the purpose of creating a false impression. Even Pope Pius VI denounced such devil's work." Of course, for the company, this was very fortunately timed, as Maximilian was no longer speaking to the press anyway. But he was still wise enough to know that this was something he couldn't comment on, even if he wanted to. But as it was, this was really the beginning of Maximilian taking more of a behind-the-scenes approach to many aspects of the business. Soon, Sales Builders Inc. came up with the idea of using Factor's celebrity friends to actively endorse his products in one of the earliest examples we have of cosmetic celebrity endorsement. Namely, the star would endorse his product, and in return, Max Factor would promote their film. Actually, this was such a mutually beneficial deal for the studios that they charged him a mere $1 for the endorsement. Plus, for Factor, this offered a huge advantage over his public targeting competitors in people like Elizabeth Arden and Helena Rubinstein, who both used society ladies in their adverts who were simply less magnetic than the celebrities accessed by Factor. In turn, he saw immediate impact for any new lines, like his 1930 invention of the lip gloss, and a bit later the bald cap in 1938, which both gave him incredible brand recognition both in and out of America. As a result, but still in the early 1930s, the brand recognition meant that Davis Factor could use the clout to establish international distribution chains, setting up distributors in Canada, Mexico, Cuba, England, and a shop in France. To meet this greatly expanded demand, they bought the land and other buildings around their flagship store and would horizontally expand into larger manufacturing and packaging facilities in a newly gutted Hollywood flagship, modernizing it, beginning in late 1934 and completing in November 1935, to an Art Deco style, complete with large letter bannering that read Max Factor Makeup Studio. I'll save you the details of this store though, just know that it was equally as grand as the previous and cost $600,000 to complete, which is almost $14 million today. And as such, the grand opening was significantly grander, with celebrities and the public, even the fire brigade had to stop people entering at one point. However, behind the scenes, a new hurdle was brewing. In the world of Hollywood, Max Factor's makeup was slowly becoming obsolete. You see, Technicolor film had been improving in the background while the black and white films were the thing to watch. And if you didn't know, in black and white movies, for cosmetics, they didn't use the real colors. Instead, a yellow foundation would read as light and a brown lipstick would read as red. So it was truly odd to see in person, but it would read perfectly on film.
To quote Max Factor's diary directly, quote, "I used a bright yellow paint for their cheeks and dark grease paint for their eyebrows. You may remember the terrifying effects of the exaggerated makeup on screen." Naturally, with the new Technicolor color film, this looked like a huge mess.
However, with the new color movies, this looked like a hot mess. The audience would simply not take the movie seriously, and so they needed an innovation. Quickly. It took a while, but eventually Max Factor did finish development on his Pancake makeup line. It was more true-toned, but had to revert to being thicker stage makeup, specifically to not cause a color glare on the actor's skin if they were to get near something bright, though I assume the formulas had improved and it no longer cracked like it used to. And the actors quite liked it. They asked Maximilian directly for it, in fact, to be made in even more natural tones so that they could wear it during the day. Factor refused, saying it was too harsh and it went against his natural makeup principles. In this sense, he was really quite conservative, as most people were at the time. But his son Frank had a better idea. They would play along with their father's conservative idea of daytime makeup for now, specifically to cause demand in the industry and in the public for the products that actors were wearing on screen. This is called scarcity marketing and is probably most famous from Kylie Cosmetics, who only made 5,000 of her initial lip kits in each color. And it really works. So this meant that in August 1937, when Pancake was officially released across stores, backed by a national in-color advertising campaign, the product flew off of shelves. He had effectively invented daytime foundation. They received their first film credit due to the product's fame and popularity, and it became a standard product in both film and in day-to-day life across the world because of their distributed countries. Interestingly, this book also goes on to say that this was also the first time the word cake had ever been used for makeup before, as it gave connotations of being heavy. Of course, in the times of makeup aversion was impossible to win with. But now that Max Factor had truly made heavy makeup looks desirable, 65 imitators hit the market within months, all using the term cake. It's a wonder how e.l.f. cosmetics didn't just spout up from the ground then. By now, Max Factor was unsurpassed in both film and daily makeup with a hyphen, and Procter & Gamble were right on their tail, offering to manufacture all the cosmetics for royalties, so effectively like a licensing deal. But of course, there was no need for that. They had already sufficiently horizontally expanded and could keep up with sales good enough without the risk of involving outsiders. In fact, they were on one of their expansion scouting trips in August 1938, this time on their way to Rome, when Maximilian received a death threat ransom note for $200 while they were stopping over in Paris. His life for $200, or about $4,500 today. I'll save that story for a future biography because it's not really linked to the business, but it shocked him so terribly that they rushed him back to LA and he died shortly after at the age of 61. For the family, this was heartbreaking, and for the business, this was very worrying. What would they do without the head of the company, the innovator of so many things? Well, this is where his sons would truly take over, and his son Frank, who was with him on that trip to Rome, legally changed his name to Max Factor Jr. in order to keep the spirit alive as he became the new head of the company. Under Max Factor Jr.'s tenure, brick-and-mortar expansion extended now to India, Hong Kong, and a new concept company, a makeup school. While in product development, fragrance became king. Having been a perfumer since the beginning, he began adding custom scents to each product, developing in an experiential aspect to the Max Factor cosmetic experience that was quite novel for the time and was exceptionally successful too. By 1939, the company was truly more global than ever, having concessions in department stores the world over, including Buenos Aires, Santiago, Brussels, Toronto, Vancouver, Ottawa, and one I didn't mention a few years back in London. By 1940, Max Jr.'s innovation had also continued to include their famous True Color lipstick that was long-lasting and color-fast, and during the Second World War, they provided makeup to be used as camouflage by the US Marine Corps. Though it's worth mentioning that cosmetics didn't really suffer in the war as much as something like fashion did, because people found that they still wanted it and that there was no way else to get it than to buy it. You can't exactly make do and mend a foundation or mascara, for example. And plus, Max Factor was still supplying for the movies, so the company really wasn't hit much from having to shut down their stores, reopening them very easily in 1945. Panstick, a stick version of their famed Pancake, then came to a massive success in 1948, the World of Beauty line in 1950, which included things like cleansing creams, night creams, lotion, talc, and facial soap. Then grooming essentials for men named Signature by Max Factor Hollywood was released in 1951. In the early to mid-1950s, Max Factor's color TV makeup was developed to be better for the increasing sensitivity of film cameras. In 1954, Erase, the iconic concealer, though it wasn't called that yet, was released. And also in 1954, a high-fi fluid makeup was released, meant to make skin vibrant in every skin tone. However, more interestingly than all of those developments, one huge factor, pun intended, was soon to see a huge upheaval. You see, in the 1950s, the early 1950s at that, there was a slump in cinema sales. This didn't really matter hugely or directly to Max Factor because they were now equally, if not more, famous for their non-theatrical makeup, but their sales had been slipping. Their gross sales fell from $17 million in 1946 to only $14.4 million in 1950, and they placed the blame on these celebrity-endorsed adverts that they had still been running throughout all of this time because they were beginning to get dated. But they had a solution. The very first national competition to find the new face of Max Factor. Naturally, this was hugely impactful, not only for the final product adverts, but for all of the thousands of young women who put in their attempts at the role. In mid-1952, after a long search, Sharon Lee Curtis won the competition and the $5,000 prize pot to appear in both an ad for Pancake makeup and True Color lipstick. and they were just as impactful as any celebrity endorsement in recent years, ensuring a new era for Max Factor without their then famed celebrity-endorsed print ads, and actually after this, moving into a California-themed branding. Another major development would happen a little later in 1956 when Max Factor absorbed Sales Builders Incorporated, their sales and distribution company, in a 100% acquisition, taking all of that in-house, reorganizing the company to fit the new needs in the process. This included building new structures to house all of the things that they needed, like offices, research facilities, etc., in a new 250,000 square foot, $3 million plant on Highland Avenue, Los Angeles, and expanding and modernizing their current manufacturing plants as well. This brings us to April 11th, 1961, when Max Factor, in an offer of 400,000 shares of Class A stock, listed on the New York Stock Exchange. Max Factor was no longer a family-run and owned business, but it was now accountable to stockholders. A board of executive staff were introduced as a result, bringing in many new grandchildren into the business, so it didn't exactly lose its family-run element. Along with this came heavy expansion from the company. In 1961, they bought Parfum Corday, expanding their perfume arm. In 1962, a new Midwest distribution center was constructed in Des Plaines, Illinois, and in the same year, a new factory in Guatemala City, Guatemala. In 1963, a factory in Toronto, Canada. In 1964, a new New York office was opened on the 21st floor of the Bankers Trust building at 280 Park Avenue. They announced a merger with another company named American Cyanamid, though it didn't pan out, and by 1967, the company's executive offices were relocated to the new Max Factor building at 6922 Hollywood Boulevard, all before the board of directors named Alfred Firestein, Max Factor's grandson-in-law, the new president and chief executive in 1968. Under his tenure, it wasn't long before another merger was considered, this time with Norton Simon Incorporated. Negotiations began in 1972. It was approved by shareholders in February 1973, and Norton Simon became the largest conglomerate in America. Quote, larger than fellow conglomerates Bristol-Myers, General Foods, Johnson & Johnson, B.F. Goodrich, PepsiCo, Nabisco, and CBS, with yearly earnings surpassing $1.1 billion. But literally the following week, hot off the heels of his biggest success, Alfred Firestein died of a stroke at only 48 years old. The vice president, Chester Firestein, so Alfred's brother, took over as president of the business under Norton Simon, with now 200,000 accounts in 144 countries, mostly in the UK and Japan. Under his reign, they also closed down the hair department entirely, which was one of their biggest departments once upon a time, and they also began licensing with the Halston line of products in 1975. But of course, this didn't last. Chester left the role in 1975 for personal reasons. Max Factor Jr. also resigned, leaving the company without any direct family members at the helm. Then came Samuel Kalish, who importantly in 1983 saw Norton Simon be acquired by Esmark, and then in 1984 Esmark merging with Beatrice Companies to make Max Factor become a drop in the ocean of brands, just fighting for air. Soon after, he was met with a string of lackluster releases and falling sales, which, though did start before he arrived at the company because they had been trying to expand their perfume division by acquiring Smith & Nephew associated companies, which gave them licensing to people like Mary Kwan, Outdoor Girl, and Miners. As well, they were trying to expand on their own perfumes, specifically with a perfume called Just Call Me Maxi that was a complete bomb and was one of the main reasons that Kalish was let go of the company. Following that, 2 more presidents came and went, and soon the family wasn't involved in the day-to-day runnings of the business, even remotely. It was the beginning of the end. The store in Hollywood closed, only to be replaced by a far smaller, only 1-story building next door, and the whole company was relocated to the East Coast, away from their quintessentially Californian image that they had curated and even banked on for promotion in the 1960s when their movie star endorsement deals finished.
Though they were reinstated by the 1970s, I should note, and have continued to this day too.
It's often phrased as a positive, but it was then in 1984 that the old store unexpectedly, and after selling a ton of their goods, reopened as a Max Factor museum to vie for the interest of the incoming tourists that were there for the Olympics. But honestly, I just can't help but think that it must have made the company look a bit passé. I mean, there's a reason Karl Lagerfeld was so against retrospectives when he was alive, but they chose what they chose, and either way, it was successful and soon became a must-see for holiday goers in the area. Quote, "Young people loved it because they missed all the glamour during the golden age," remembered Fran Tigel. And old-timers loved it because they grew up during that era and could identify with all the big stars and the movies. But we were surprised to discover how many people thought Max Factor was just a brand name, not a real person. Actually, in this regard, it was because of its success that the planned sale of the building was completely halted, and instead restoration to the building began. Though of course it was under a conglomerate, so the restoration was painfully slow. In fact, they had only been able to finish one floor by the late 1980s when it became frequented by new stars like Jack Nicholson, Arnold Schwarzenegger, and Danny DeVito, who then, or specifically Jack Nicholson, then convinced Paramount Pictures to help restore the main salon
with a sum of $20,000 by replicating what was once there with exactly October 1946 details in all of its splendor.
But that wasn't the only development to happen in this time. You see, back in 1984, a sale of the entire parent company Beatrice Companies had been begun to Kohlberg Kravis Roberts and Company. But Max Factor wasn't cut in on the deal. Instead, they were sold to an executive of the Beatrice Companies company, Joel Smillow, who then sold Max Factor to Revlon's Ron Perelman. This is a lot. I'm hoping the visuals really help with this, but Perelman actually seemed to be a good thing for Max Factor. He wanted to return it to its Hollywood roots and bring back the excitement to the brand once more. But it didn't last. In 1991, Max Factor was purchased by Procter & Gamble for $1.14 billion, which is about $2.6 billion today, and more than double what Perelman had paid for it in 1986 when he bought it for $500 million US. But again, the company just continued to fall. They shut down the museum in 1996 despite protests, though it was eventually saved by a lady named Jonelle Dadigan, who bought the property and restored it back to exactly its 1934 specs, even to the most minute detail, which led to finally reopening the museum in 2003, just when Max Factor once again found themselves in financial trouble. Sales were not good. They really hadn't had a hit product for a long time, and financially, things were just terrible for Max Factor. It also didn't help that Davis and Dean Factor, the grandsons of Max Factor, had set up their own cosmetic business to rival Max Factor named Smashbox Cosmetics in 1999, which I know you know, so let me know if you want a history of them as well. And finally, by 2001, fearing competition with their star brand CoverGirl, Procter & Gamble completely pulled Max Factor out of the US shortly after their 100-year anniversary. In fairness, Max Factor did continue in the UK, and I'm sure it continued in other countries as well. I remember it very clearly from Boots at the very least. Specifically, I remember the Miracle Touch Full Coverage Foundation and the Full Slash Effect Mascara, which were actually quite popular in the UK at the time. Honestly, if I was to admit it, I probably would imagine that those two products kept them in business in the UK while they were pulling out of America. But it was never a particularly desirable brand, even in the UK where it was doing okay. It was just a brand that you bought because it was cheap, not necessarily because you wanted the Max Factor brand. Honestly, for all intents and purposes, the brand was dead. Procter & Gamble didn't seem to care, and frankly, neither did shoppers. By 2015, it was announced Coty would acquire both CoverGirl and Max Factor, as both were not seeing good returns anymore. By 2016, the sale was completed and it was relaunched in the US within the same year. But unfortunately, the sales did not pick up. It had equity, it had all of this history to draw from. It's just they couldn't find that key differentiator or that key hero product to make them truly a hit again. This brings us to 2018, when Coty completely relaunched the brand with all new packaging and a little bit revamped logo. But to be honest, it wasn't particularly distinct. This advert that I'm showing you right now, you probably just assumed it's from 2018. It's not. This is from 2017. This is an advert from 2019. And there's not that much difference between the two. They have similar fonts, they have the same kind of color palette in the adverts, and they both use similar wording like leading lady in their promotional materials in order to tie it back to their movie roots. But it's not a very distinct rebrand or repackaging, really. There's no hero product, really, maybe the foundation, I don't know. There's just nothing really definitive for the brand that one can't get elsewhere. Its price point is affordable, and at least in the UK, it has a lot of stockists that well reflect its accessible price point. But the product and the promotion are where it's really, really lacking, and the fact that you can't buy it directly from their own website is also quite archaic. This, to me, is the biggest chink in their armor right now. Its price point is low, it's £6 whatever, it's very cheap for foundation. So with that, you can assume their target market is young people. But then why would you not allow these young people to shop online? I'm not sure about America, but I had a debit card at I think 15 or 16, so I could and did shop online at that age. It's also an easy impulse purchase if you just get people to the site because it's so affordable. And frankly, there's less competition than if you were to only have sales on Amazon or Boots, where your competitors are. Then, if you consider the promotion, they're still going for celebrity endorsement, which I do understand is true to the brand. It's good in theory, but really, in honesty, I do think their choice of Priyanka Chopra, which began in 2021, is a difficult choice, considering how controversial her opinions are currently to a younger audience. Her views on things like feminism are a little bit warped, and the younger generation are very susceptible to that. So it just seems like an odd choice to have her be the face of the company. She's gorgeous, but does she fit the demographic that they're trying to reach? I'm not sure. In a nutshell, seemingly, currently the brand is in limbo. It doesn't really gear all the elements towards the same people. It's a product for young people, a celebrity for old people, a price point for young people, and desirability for no one. It can come back, and I honestly hope it does. Max Factor has the kind of provenance that's impossible to fake with these new brands. But why then is it not built that way? Perhaps it's just that the company is too big to have the agility to compete in the way that it needs to, but they had a chance to fix that with the relaunch in 2018 and they just didn't. Honestly, more than anything else, it's just disappointing to see such an incredible brand that invented airbrushing, lip gloss, waterproof mascara, and the word makeup to be reduced to a £6 foundation that I can't even buy on their own online store. I hope the best for them, but the branding really extremely needs an overhaul. I of course do understand the value in having Max Factor as the cash cow that it probably is for the Coty group. I would imagine it has reliable sales. But given the incredible history that this brand has, there is ridiculous potential for Max Factor to come back and be an extremely desirable brand once again. It doesn't even have to change its target market or its price point in order to do so. Just a better point of view, maybe a bit better advertising, they could very easily come back. This current iteration of the brand simply does not well represent who they are and where they have been. They have value, they're just not using it. Thank you so much for watching this video. Please do like and subscribe for more videos like this. If you're interested in videos like these but about fashion brands, do check out my fashion channel Understitch, which is linked here. And a special thank you goes out to my patrons over on Patreon, some of whose names are on the screen now. All content used in this video is done so in accordance with the principles of fair use. However, if you have any concerns, please contact me directly at contact@understitch.co.uk.